Good afternoon, Sandro.
Good afternoon, Albie.
Thank you so much for joining us for this live session and for the Q&A that you've agreed to enter into, and for helping us launch the Happiness Institute. Much appreciated. The first question that's come in is, how can we maintain our mental health and help our communities while still maintaining strict physical distancing protocols?
Yeah, it's a great question. In many respects, there's never been a more important time to maintain our mental health. And, I've been very happy that the language has shifted from social distancing to physical distancing. Initially, we started talking about social distancing. But the key is we should not be social distancing. We should be physical distancing. And physical distancing means you and I are not in the same place. But how do we maintain our community? Well, we are talking. We are actually involved in something that is together. The Happiness Festival that you've created is exactly an example of that. We have used tools that are available to us to create social proximity while maintaining physical distance. And I actually think that should color everything we do. I think in some respects, because we cannot be physically present, we have to make an ever greater effort to use technologies available to us to narrow social distance.
Thank you for that answer. One of the people that I interviewed was very optimistic about where we are at the moment, which was uncharacteristic, given that he is a grumpy northerner. And he basically said to me that one of the things about finding solutions is you've got to really understand the problem. And he said, basically, we understand a lot of the problems with our societies at the moment, particularly to do with how we respond to pandemics. Would you share that optimism in terms of understanding of how we, of a superior understanding of how we understand the problems we face on the healthcare side?
Yeah, I prefer optimism to pessimism. I think optimism is a very useful form of resistance to difficulties that the world is facing. So yes, I share optimism on principle. Now, on pragmatics, we are going through an extraordinary period. I mean, in many respects, it's a joyless period as people are isolated. It's actually hard to find joy, hard to find pleasure. But it also is a period of extraordinary reflection and a period with potential for growth. So am I optimistic? Yes. Look, this period is hitting a lot of people very hard, and one has to have the suitable respect for that, for the challenges the moment entails. But this too shall pass. The moment shall pass. In human history, moments like this have come. They have all passed. We are better prepared now for an epidemic like this than we've ever been in human history. That does not obviate the bungling and the mishandling that has happened around this. But leaving that aside, this moment shall pass. And the question is, do we learn from this moment and emerge stronger from it? And I would rather believe that we will and that we shall than the alternative.
Thank you for that optimism, much needed. There's another question that just come in, which is, what structural changes would you recommend to promote more happiness? Are there any specific examples that you can provide?
Yeah, I think the mistake that we can make around happiness is thinking that it all comes from within. And I think we misunderstand how much of our happiness comes from the world around us. So we can create the context for our happiness. And happiness requires, for most of us, the social interaction. It requires the access to at least foundational resources to be able to achieve what we want to achieve in life. It requires the opportunity for fulfillment. All of those are needs for happiness. So we should be thinking about creating a world that has those resources, that allows you, Albie, allows me, Sandro, to be happy. So I think it is an active engagement that makes us happy. It is something that emerges from a thoughtfully setting up the world in a way that generates our happiness.
Another question in from Marta, who says, I'm really worried that when vaccines are finally available, it won't be available to the people who most need it in our society. How do we solve this distribution problem?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's a lot of thinking right now going on around vaccines and how to make vaccines available and how to make them available for people who need them. I think there's a lot to be worried about around vaccines in terms of people also not accepting it and us not seeing the benefits that we could have from those vaccines in enough time. But I'm hopeful, and this goes back to the optimism theme, Albie, that there are enough people thinking about this that it's going to be a moment when we can actually see the light, where we recognize collectively both that vaccines matter and that people who are most vulnerable should be first in line to getting the vaccines. I'm hoping that as these messy processes sort themselves out, we will get to a place where people who need them will have vaccines. And people who need them, the first and foremost, are people who are emergency workers, who are the front lines, who are most at risk of getting COVID. And then we need to make sure that vaccines are delivered to the people who are most at risk of contracting COVID, which are typically people who are marginalized, people who have fewer resources. Those are the people who need them first. And we should make sure that those people are at the front of the line.
Agree with that sentiment. One response to one question from Kiyun is, what are the long-term social and economic impacts of the pandemic, especially in comparison to historical pandemics?
Well, that's an excellent question. And I suppose the question, I'll start with answering the comparison. It depends on what you're comparing to. If you're comparing to the bubonic plague, if you're comparing to many plagues in the early part of centuries in the modern era, then we are doing great. This is in some respects nothing compared to pandemics where millions and millions of people died. That's the comparison part. Having said that, that is not meant to diminish the scope of this pandemic. This is we are living collectively as a world, at least in the Western world, through three different enormous traumas. One is COVID and the threat and risk of COVID. The other one are the economic consequences. And the other one is a reckoning with issues of social justice that have been around for centuries but have now bubbled to the surface. So there are enormous consequences to this moment. And I think we know that both the threat of harm like COVID and economic consequences of COVID have mental health consequences. We know that depression, for example, is increasing around COVID. We know that suicide follows events like COVID as well as economic recession. And we also know, and we tend to forget this, and I worry sometimes that those of us who engage in things like happiness festivals are responsible for forgetting this, that the people who are most affected both by COVID and by the economic consequences of COVID are the people who already are health have-nots, the people who are already marginalized, people who have fewer socioeconomic resources, who have worse health. So what this moment is doing is it is widening health divides. It is making people who already had less have even less. So there is a responsibility for everybody in all spaces to make sure that we are channeling resources and trying to help those who could benefit most from the help. And those are the people who are already marginalized and vulnerable.
I think that's a critical point, because you've seen this narrative emerge in terms of COVID being a great leveler, and yet actually what it's doing is accentuating the inequality in our society.
Yeah, so, I don't think COVID is a leveler at all. I disagree with that. I actually think I think COVID is resulting in from my professional world, which is health. It's taking health gaps and widening them. I mean, we see it. I'll talk about the United States, where I live. COVID has been much higher rates among Black Americans and among white Americans, both in terms of getting COVID and dying from COVID. These are health gaps that already exist along all sorts of other health dimensions, and COVID is widening those gaps. So I worry that if we're not paying attention, and in large part we have not been, we are going to result with ever greater burden of poor health on those who are already marginalized, who already had poor health.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree. I think the next question then leads itself naturally towards public policy. And from a public policy perspective, how can we make sure that our future planet doesn't just survive but thrives and is able to prevent the same sort of cataclysmic crisis that has been caused by this pandemic? What can we do to make sure that from a policy
I love this question. I love this question. I could talk for a long time about this question. Let me address it by way of metaphor, if I may. So the question is, what has gone wrong this time? And I've come to think of the world as a ship. It's like we're a ship and going through a storm. Right? A ship going through a storm. There are three elements that the ship needs to go through a storm. One is a good captain, the other one's a good crew, and the other one's a good ship. So why am I saying this? Because I think those three elements are the elements that we need to invest in to get through the next storm well. What are those three elements? The captain is political leadership. It's a responsible political leadership that elevates science over fiction, that is evidence-informed and responsive, suitably humble, and can make decisions informed by humility about what we don't know. That's the captain. That's politics. The ship itself is the infrastructure that allows us to deal with pandemics like this. That means having surveillance systems and having this surge capacity to create, say, contact tracers and testing that one needs when something like this happens. The sailors on board the ship are us people, and we want to make sure that our population is as healthy as possible when times are not tough. We want to invest in not having preventable disease when we are not facing the duress of a pandemic, so that when a pandemic happens, we do not see what we saw in this time, which is that people who are who have comorbidity are then most at risk of having consequences of COVID. So policy needs to address the captain, the sailors, and the ship. Political leadership, the practical infrastructure that can mitigate the consequences of a pandemic, and creating a healthy population so that we are robust, resilient to the effects of another stressor like a pandemic.
I really like that metaphor. I think that's it's very clear, and I think enormously helpful to reframe how we can get through this this sort of problem next time around, making sure that we have the right captain, the right crew, and the right infrastructure behind us. There's another question coming in, which is how can developing countries like India cope with COVID and try to maintain or improve public well-being in a severely resource-constrained environment?
Yeah, I think it's a terrific question. I'm not sure that the approach of any country should be different, meaning that I think every country needs to figure out how it can best mitigate the spread of a pandemic within its resource envelope. And I think India has a particular resource envelope, United States has a resource envelope, UK has a resource envelope. And of course, saying India is a gross overgeneralization, since there are multiple areas within India with very different resource structures. Fundamentally, to mitigate the spread of a pandemic, one needs to minimize interpersonal contact. That's at a simple level of risk mitigation. That's what we need to do. If we all stayed in our couches and saw no other humans, given that this is person-to-person transmission, there would be no spread of the virus. That has to be balanced with the need to have a society that functions, and with us meeting our social needs, our economic needs, because fundamentally, everything we do is towards creating a world where we can achieve our aspirations. So in the Indian context, the question is, how can you reduce person-to-person contact while maintaining social functioning? And the answer to that is different in India than it is in the United States. Within the United States, frankly, the answer is different in Massachusetts, where I live, than it is in California. So I really think that in the hubbub, in the noise around COVID, we have lost sight of what we're trying to do. What we're trying to do is reduce interpersonal contact, but do it in such a way that we maintain social and economic function.
That makes sense. I'd love to ask you about competition as opposed to collaboration. And I've been reading and it's sort of been very heartwarming to me to understand how epidemiologists are collaborating in a way that wasn't previously seen. And I'm wondering whether, in terms of sort of abstract perception, you feel like the era of competition that we've lived through over the last 30 years, let's say since Thatcher and Reagan implemented sort of capitalist structures that we have in place now, are sustainable moving forward, and whether or not the collaboration that you're seeing both at the state level and the federal level, but also at an individual level or professional level, is going to be sustained, so that we can not only get through this crisis, but rebuild our societies so they're fit for the future, so that rising inequality, as an example, is no longer something that our grandkids are talking about.
Yeah, I hope, although I'm not sure that I believe it, but I hope that zero-sum competition is over and done. And I'm talking about specifically about zero-sum competition. Zero-sum competition means that it's the kind of competition where I win, you lose. And that kind of competition fundamentally privileges individuals who, through combination of idiosyncratic circumstance, end up at the front of the line and says nobody else is meritorious. That kind of competition robs us of a wealth of ideas that we should have and that should contribute to our thinking and our doing in a pluralistic society. Competition of the form that encourages us all to do ever better. Competition that is and embracing competition that says we are all in this together, but now let's see how much we can push ourselves. That kind of competition can get us to excellence. So I would like to see zero-sum competition gone. I would like to encourage a compassionate competition, but competition by definition embraces collaboration, because while it says you and I may be in this together and we're trying to see how much we can push ourselves, it also means that by helping each other, we are going to push ourselves further. So I think it's a really complex set of issues, and I think sometimes in a public discussion, we end up being very reductive about this as well. There is capitalism, which is all competitive, and there's socialism, where there's no competition, and it's either one or the other. Well, I think that those are false dichotomies. I think fundamentally, we want a world where we push ourselves to excellence, where we achieve more, where we achieve in artistic expression, technological achievement, in scholarship. That's okay, and it's okay for us to say we want to push ourselves to get to a place of excellence, but to do so in a way where we also protect those who do not necessarily get to the front of the line, to make sure that everybody can live a rich life with dignity.
The sort of pragmatism laced with optimism that you're sharing with us today, I think is much needed in politics. I'm sure I'm not the only one on the call that feels that in terms of the US, but also more broadly the European countries. How can we make sure that the captain of those ships that you alluded to earlier are more prepared for these sorts of situations, but also how can we make sure that the quality or the caliber of the politician that we have is moving in the right direction as opposed to the wrong direction?
Yeah, I'll take pragmatic optimism as sort of the highest form of compliment, and I actually hope that all our politicians would have pragmatic optimism. I think sometimes hope. There's the aphorism that hope is not a strategy. I agree, hope is not a strategy, but I think hope is a very important part of a strategy. And we want political leadership, captains of the ship, who are pragmatic but also optimistic. I mean, how do we ensure that? Well, I think we ensure that by doing two things. One is obviously by voting for that in the context where we can vote. And the other one is by holding those in public office accountable to a form of being. And actually, although you asked me about politics, and as a result I'm talking about public office, I think that's also true of private enterprises, which shape an increasing part of our lives. I think it's important to hold people in leadership positions in private institutions to that same pragmatic optimism, where hope is a core part of the strategy, but it is not hope that substitutes for careful, pragmatic thinking about decisions that have to be made to get us through the storm.
There's a question here about the university department and how, in light of COVID, they've responded to the crisis, and how, moving forward, is there a shift in terms of your focus to help society more broadly achieve greater well-being, resilience, and happiness?
The question was about universities specifically?
Yeah, about the university specifically.
Yeah.
I guess, what role do universities have to play in this in this crisis?
Well, I think I would go to first principles. And what's the fundamental role of universities to begin with? Universities they really do three things. Number one is they generate scholarship, science, and artistic expression. Number two is they prepare the next generation. And number three is, I think universities also have a role in translating their scholarship, their science, their artistic expression to the end of creating a better world. Those are the three things universities do. I don't think that has changed at all. I think the questions we ask, what scholarship is engaged in, what scientific questions that are around, how artistic expression has come to help teach us better about the moment, that should be and has been informed by COVID. I think how we teach our students, both the modality of how we teach digital training, in-person training, the content of our education should be informed by COVID. And I think in terms of translation and engagement in the world, we have seen a number of universities, a number of scholars all over the world who have really been engaged in terms of informing, influencing, inflecting public policy. So I think universities have been carrying out their responsibility there. I think it's been a tough time. It's been a tough time for universities, like it's been for all other institutions. But when I step back from myself, it's a moment in time that teaches us how important universities are. If we as a society did not have institutions whose job it was to generate ideas, to prepare the next generation, and to make sure that those ideas help inform what we do, we would be in a much worse place, right? So it makes it clear. I thought a moment like this, one of the things about the COVID moment is it sharpens and clarifies. It doesn't create, but it sharpens and clarifies. And to my mind, it makes it clear the role that universities play. And Now, of course, it's on universities to rise to the challenge and to do ever better at what they were doing. This goes back to our earlier conversation about collaboration and competition. I think universities are competitive places within themselves and across one another. And that's a good thing. That is a good thing as long as that competition is done with an eye towards ever achieving excellence and in a way that preserves and protects those who are more vulnerable in that competition.
The question here about technology, all the way from Napa in the US, about whether or not you're one of those people that sees technology as a panacea for the world's problems, particularly, I guess, the problems that we're facing at the moment, or whether you see it as slightly more nuanced.
Yeah, I like technology. I'm a big fan of technology. And at the same time, I don't think it's a panacea for anything. I think technology is a tool. I don't think we live for our tools. I think our tools are means to an end. And the question is, what's our end? And our end, as far as I'm concerned, and I suppose the reason I'm participating in the Happiness Festival is because I think our end is to live rich, fulfilled lives where everybody has a chance to realize their potential. Insofar as technology can help us achieve that, that's great. If technology has no utility in helping us get there, then I'm not interested in technology. So I suppose I'm very pragmatic about the use of technology. I think technology, it's cool. I think technology is cool. I like both new apps, new phones, and new everything. But I also want to make sure that I use that to achieve my ends and not have the technology itself be the end.
And what is the most exciting solution that you've seen in terms of technology helping with the COVID response? Is it GPS, or is it more on the sort of vaccine and therapeutics space, or what is it?
Well, I'll give you a serious and a less serious answer. I think a serious answer is that the rapidity with which we are approaching vaccine for COVID is extraordinary and unprecedented. If we can get a vaccine in the next year, it will still be 3-4 years faster than any other previous vaccine. And I think that is an enormous testament to the technology behind vaccines and how that has galloped forward quickly. That's high-end technology. On a less serious point of view, I think one of the challenges of the moment is how one communicates the lessons that we're learning at the moment to, let's say, a younger generation. I have 2 teenagers, and I have been learning through their eyes how much they've learned around COVID and health messaging around through TikTok. And leaving aside the sort of political entanglements of large companies like TikTok, that's fine. I mean, I think that is technology reaching different generations and different generations making use of technology for their own ends. And I think that is interesting and important, and I think we should not forget that.
There's a question here from Reho who says, do you think that a decade from now we will be far more resilient as a global society?
I hope so. I think if we're not, we'll be missing an opportunity. I think COVID is a transformative moment. It should be a transformative moment. It is in the pandemic space. I think it is the next transformative pandemic after HIV/AIDS. And HIV/AIDS changed a lot of things about our society, changed our social norms, changed cultural norms, changed medicine, changed public health. And I think COVID is going to do the same thing. I think COVID should do the same thing. I think if it doesn't, we're not listening, we're not learning. So I think if we do not emerge more resilient, we would have wasted this moment.
There's a question from a super fan here, Sandro. Thank you so much for excellent talk, Sandro. Could you please briefly talk about your latest book, Well, which I read and loved? How can doctors in other countries learn from it?
Well, my book, Well, which is subtitled What We Need to Talk About When We Talk About Health, says that health is not about medicines and doctors, that medicines and doctors matter, but Well says our health is about our people and place and politics. It is about the world around us. And in Well, I use this metaphor, which I'll share here, which is a football team or soccer team metaphor. So when you're playing football, you have 11 players shooting the ball on the other side. And those 11 players, one of them is a goalkeeper. The goalkeeper can use his hands and whole body to stop the ball from going to net. But the other 10 players move the ball upfield. Well, it's very clear to anybody who watches football that you need all 11 players to win a game. Well, who are those 11 players? The goalkeeper is medicine. It's doctors. So there's no question if a ball is coming to the net, you want a good doctor to save the ball. But the other 10 players are housing and lack of violence and gender equity and fair wages and clean air and drinkable water. Those are the other 11 players. And when you understand health that way, you understand that health is not just about the goalkeeper, it's also about the other 10 players. And well is about those other 10 players and about how we understand that building a world around us is essential to creating a healthier world.
There's lots more questions coming in, but I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to ask you one final question, which is, I guess, what do you think the next 6 months looks like? There's lots of people that are talking about herd immunity, lots of people who are talking about how we sort of can transition into normal life seamlessly, and then others who are more nihilistic and more pessimistic about the next 6 months and feel like we basically should be maintaining social distancing and staying in lockdown. So what, to you, is the sort of pragmatic, optimistic perspective of the next 6 months?
I think the pragmatic optimistic perspective is it depends on where one is in the world and depends on the stage of the pandemic where one is in the world. I think in places where the case positivity is low and generally WHO standards are under 5%, that is a very good case for slow easing of the lockdowns, for reopening of businesses, re-engaging with life in all its dimensions, while being careful, while wearing masks, while washing one's hands, one trying to minimize social distancing. In places where you have case positivity that's high, and in many places, some places in the US right now it's over 10, 20%, I think those places need to be much more careful, to mitigate the spread of the pandemic by limiting interpersonal contact and potentially restricting some of the engagements, public sector, private sector engagements that otherwise characterize a fully realized life. So I think it really depends. I think the next 6 months will be a mix of those two approaches, depending on cases with high or low case positivity. And I think the next 6 months will show us whether a vaccine is going to be readily available in early 2021. I hope it is. I think if it is, then we'll be entering a phase of making sure that the vaccine distribution is rational, fair, and just, moving to a world where then we move beyond COVID and learn from COVID and ask really the hard questions. How are we going to restructure the world so that we are resilient and robust to the next pandemic?
I'm going to go back on my word and ask you one more question, because another good question has just come in, if you don't mind. Last question.
Please.
Could you please discuss the importance of global data sharing and the importance of having medicines and public health strategies being developed in a collaborative environment?
Yeah, I think if we do not learn the lesson from COVID that health problems are global problems, then I don't know when we ever will. COVID has shown there's no such thing as blocking yourself off as a country and isolating yourself from the world. We are all part of an interconnected world. With that same spirit, data should be available widely. We should be collecting data abundantly. We should make the data available. There are historic, almost psychological barriers to data sharing, to this notion that we should be careful about data ownership. The truth is, we often use things like privacy as a bit of a fig leaf for our anxiety around sharing data. The world is better with data being widely available. There are a lot of smart people out there who can do things with data and illuminate what we're going through by having data widely available. So I really hope that what emerges from this moment is an awareness that we should have widely available data to inform how we think and inform how we act in a moment like this.
Sandro, thank you so much for your time and for participating in the Happiness Institute. Have a wonderful afternoon. And I think your brand of pragmatic optimism has certainly left an impression on me.
Thank you very much. Have a great afternoon.
Bye-bye.